There's also a skull thing. I think I was going to run by the Rieshlings for a few minutes, yeah.
The pen that
Yeah.
doesn't explode on me.
I have an extra one if you need one.
Oh, nice.
Okay.
They're skimping on water, though, a little bit.
It's one bottle for two people, so you have to share the water.
Okay.
Oh. Oh God.
You have to
Okay.
share water
Makes
with
me
a
little
Yemenis person, so that's going to be
Yemen-
harder, you know.
Here now, and see it on this panel. You're all-
It's water's life and death in Yemen, so you know
What is it?
it's life and death, right?
It's true. Even right here in Perugia, you gotta watch out.
Yeah.
I mean, really. Yeah.
Those hills are slippery. They are.
Well, I had a shower this morning. It reminded me of the apartment I had in London where the shower, I mean, obviously we're not famed for our water pressure in Britain, and I actually thought it was probably quicker to spit on myself
Yeah.
than to have a shower. Like, it was so bad.
The photographers come like rushing up and take a lot of pictures. It's like
Freaky.
I don't know what the pictures are for, but like it's a lot of pictures in the midst, like at the beginning of this.
Okay.
I was taken aback by it all. I was like drawn to
Rachel,
distraction.
don't say. We of course expect you to be trailed by paparazzi the whole time.
Really, I was like, what? See, it's just like this. It's like,
Yeah. I'll just give my fake smile.
yeah, just
Oh, it's good. Oh, it's good. I wouldn't know. Listen, oh, look, there's been a twinkle.
They never take good pictures of me, but you can only have so many pictures taken of you saying that's a bad picture, that's a bad picture, where you just have to acknowledge you're a goofy looking person, so, you know, you're not going to get a good picture.
Just for school, I mean, it did feel like sort of some night I climbed up the laundry basket. One might look like I had a stroke, which was always that reminder of never go near a camera when you're eating or speaking.
Right.
Kind of thing, that particular thing is blown.
Yeah.
gives us like a high sign when we're ready to start.
Okay. That was my voice.
Should we start? Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the session that stands between you and your cocktail. We're going to be very, very interesting, so you don't try to sneak out early into the sunshine and get your drink. I'm Rachel White from The Guardian, and we have an excellent panel right now about solutions and reporting on solutions to solve some of the world's biggest problems. And we have a terrific panel. We have Raja Althaibani from Witness. We have Nicola Reindorp, which every time I look at it, I think raindrop, which is not right, from Crisis Action, and Drew Sullivan from OCCRP, which I'm going to let him tell you what the letters mean, though I know them. The Skoll Foundation has brought us together today for this panel, which is terrific. And it's also nice to be talking about solutions. The last panel I moderated was about impact. This panel is about solutions, and all of these things for The Guardian sit at the heart of our journalism and the way we think about what we're serving to our audiences and our relationship with our audiences. And it's exciting to be able to talk to people who are working in organizations and on the ground, who are not only bringing about change and trying to solve the problems of the world, but also thinking specifically about the role that journalism has in doing that, which I think is a piece that's too frequently missed. I think a lot of the time, there's a lot of organizations doing a lot of good, hoping that the things that they do will be recognized and that they'll change the world. And I believe strongly, and I think everyone on this panel would probably will agree, that there's a role for journalism to accelerate that work, to highlight that work, to bring attention to the things that are important so that you surround an issue and sort of take it on in a bigger way than would be possible if you weren't reaching, more people to share it with. So we're going to talk about sort of how they leverage the media, how you leverage media to solve the world problem. But I want to start by letting everyone on the panel say something about their organization, the work that they're doing, the way they think about journalism and storytelling as part of their mission and part of their purpose and part of the way that they're bringing about change. And I'll start with you, Drew, because you're right next to me.
Okay, my name is Drew Sullivan, and that long, nasty set of characters stands for the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, but you can just say, oh crap, if it makes it, easier for you. And OCCRP is it's probably the world's largest investigative reporting organization, although that you've never heard of. We're in 6 continents. We've got over 60 investigative editors. We have about 200 people on staff, but we work with about 600 reporters beyond that. And our mission really is to create a global ecosphere where investigative reporting, cross-border collaborative investigative reporting can prosper and grow by offering resources and expertise and networking. We basically help people with everything they can't afford to have on their own. So we have knowledge management systems that we've built. We've got access to world-class research and all sorts of things. And the idea is just to get as many investigative stories out there on crime and corruption as we can.
Nicola,
Thanks.
you have to push your button. I learned that the last time.
So I have the privilege to serve Crisis Action, which exists to forge collaborations to protect civilians from war. So it's a thorny problem, but with a solution and a track record we're really proud of. You'll hear this, spot some things coming up. Collaboration is important. And also being behind the scenes. We like to say we're one of the most impactful organisations you won't have heard of. Because we forge collaborations, and by design, we exist to stay out of the limelight. So the way we work, when conflicts occur, for example, right now in Sudan, or Ukraine, or Afghanistan, or Yemen, Crisis Action rapidly mobilizes from a global network of humanitarian and human rights conflict prevention organizations to understand what's at stake for civilians at risk, what can be done, and what can Crisis Action help those organizations come together to do to achieve and influence politics and policy in ways they could not alone. We'll work with faith leaders, business people, always privileging and listening first to the voices of those that are affected, which again I think is one of those themes that comes through. Who is it that actually can tell the story in a way that nobody else can, of those that are living through something? And we don't have a profile. We're laser focused on impact. What is it that's going to change to spur peace talks, to get women at the policy-making table, to get war criminals locked up, to get arms sales halted, all of which Crisis Action has done. So that focus on impact means we're not seeking the limelight to be quoted in the media, but instead what we seek to do is to try and think of ourselves as a one-stop shop for you. We can give you access to insight of what's happening on the ground, to try and share what's happening in negotiations behind the scenes around conflicts. It can be around giving context to explain why is it that the conflict is taking place, because it's always a choice. And whose choice is it? What is the colour that you might want? What are the new angles that you might want? So, for example, for us on Yemen, working with the New York Times, the Washington Post, others, giving them access to off-the-record interviews with UN officials to give the state of affairs on peace talks, being able to connect up to Yemenis to tell the stories of what's happening in their country, thinking of Russia to my left. Which has converted to stopping an attack on a major port or halting US arms sales to Saudi Arabia, and now the peace deal and the prisoner swap that you might have picked up. Some of you might have been reporting and telling us that story. And I think there's lots of ways that we think about when we ask ourselves, like, why does the change, if the solution we've got is so great, why does it not happen? We think about barriers to change, and working with the media is part of all of them. Is it because there's not clear there's a solution? Shining a light on what the solution is and who's got it. Is it because the system doesn't know? How do you help draw attention? Is it because there's no constituency to reward change? And the media, you both find those constituencies and you help inspire and engage those constituencies. Or it might be because there's vested interests. And again, Drew to my right, how many of you in this room have done incredibly brave work exposing the corrupt forces that are underpinning what for us is often at the heart of why civilians are at risk?
Excellent, thank you. These are great introductions. And Raja, Tell us about Witness.
Oh, well, it's a very, very loaded question. So I work for Witness. I head our Middle East and North Africa work. I've been at Witness for over a decade, which is quite a while. And Witness is an international human rights organization that's quite niche. We focus on video technology and try to stay a few steps ahead of emerging trends and technologies, really focusing on building the capacity of local practitioners around the world. When I started at Witness, we were definitely not working globally. We were really focused on supporting or collaborating on partnerships that were multi-year partnerships. But again, with the digital revolution, we knew there was a major need for creating greater access to resources and guidance around using video, using technology, all these new emerging tools for audiences are typically, don't have the privilege and the opportunities like we do to even sit here or, go to university or do trainings. But are forced into situations where they have to take on the role of a journalist or an investigator or an evidence collector or researcher in their own times of crisis. And so I'm a former citizen journalist in Yemen. I reported I was fresh out of school and took on that role. So when I found Witness, I really connected to the mission. In large part because I was a media practitioner that didn't have the capacity to do the reporting that I needed to do, and I didn't have the access to the guidance and tools that would help me do it in an impactful way, but more importantly, safely and ethically. So when I found Witness, there was a very strong, I felt very connected to the work, and over a decade later, I'm no longer a citizen journalist, but I'm working with incredible local practitioners and experts, many of whom can't be here today, but are fighting the fight right now as we speak. And so I hope I do them justice today on the panel. So thank you, everyone.
That's great. Well, let's get into it. So here's my first question for you. So there's all different kinds of reporting. All reporting does not lead to solutions, and all kinds of reporting doesn't lead to impact. From your perspectives, what are the kinds of what kinds of reporting do you see leading towards solutions most often? And if you could give an example, and I'm going to take you all in random order. So Nicola, you get to go first.
Well, I think it's the nature of the problem you're trying to solve. So this business about the barriers to change, like you said before, I sometimes think, when there's a problem, let's kind of solve it by put the patient in the warm bath and hope the pain goes away. And what you're looking for is the single point on the body to put the acupuncture needle and to release the pressure that's going to get the change. So I think different kinds of journalism contribute to solutions in different ways. There are times where in mobilizing or inspiring a constituency, it is the story that does help connect somebody that is not distant. It feels really close when it is happening. Stories of Ukrainian artists meeting South African activists, and the former First Lady of South Africa, Graça Machel, saying to Ukrainian women artists, your struggle is ours, and your pain is ours. At a time where the biggest story is, the Global South is not backing Ukraine and is being friendly to Russia. So I think that story being really powerful. Or at other times, the exposure of the vested interests of South Sudanese warlords using Kenyan bank accounts in order to stash the looted resources of South Sudan, whether that's oil, wood, teak. We worked with a documentary maker, a Kenyan documentary maker, and it was the media covering that story, exposing what's happening in South Sudan, and covering the popular mobilization that happened in Kenya, protesting about what was going on, that ended up with those bank accounts getting shut down by the Kenyan central bank, and one of the sons of the warlords getting put in prison. So different kinds of reporting, I think, can do different things. I do think one of the things, though, that I think is often and that incredible recognizing, and maybe that one of the things that we want to draw out, Rachel, about the struggles, that how could we strengthen the collaboration between the media and those of us that are seeking change, is it's so often I find myself reading something and saying, oh, but tell us why. Tell us why. And that exposure of why things are happening, of being able to get to the context or the nub. And so it's okay to start to think about, so what needs to be done by who? Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is also another piece of that amazing journalistic thing of getting to the bottom of stuff, mm-hmm. Of really doing that work, of getting the context, but being able to get to the, so why is this happening?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to turn it over to Raja in a second, but just picking up on this, something that we noticed at The Guardian when we were first reporting on the war in Ukraine, our foreign desk obviously was most focused on the war and the conflict itself, and yet there was a really, really important story about the refugee crisis at the border with Poland and with Hungary, and we actually were able to take one of our philanthropic projects supported by Humanity United called Rights and Freedom, where we have a pretty ample budget, and deploy a set of reporters from the foreign desk at the border to report on the humanitarian crisis. Women, children, people not races, like really rampant racism, trafficking. And at The Guardian, we found that surrounding where, like in terms of solutions, there's not really a solution to a war at the beginning of a war other than ending the war, but we were able to find a connection to solutions through that lens, which I think is what Nicola is also talking about. And I think sometimes it's just the other part of the story that you find that brings the solutions piece of it.
And I think one of the great privileges, any of you have got this propaganda, flick to the middle page, it's the incredible people that, it's why I do what I do, where in the midst of human beings doing the worst that we can do to each other, we find human beings at their most inspirational. And again, so many of you in this room, I think, will know that. It is when you see people who are from Yemen, from Afghanistan, from Sudan, from Ukraine, where you listen to their perspective, the roots of the solutions lie in those mm-hmm. in those experiences and those voices. So again, I think, as you say, being able to find and to be able to have time, resources to reach people, hear people, and then report on it, absolutely a really important part of a solution.
Yeah.
It's just to add on to what you both have said, I think from the perspective of, I think you mentioned it earlier, of like the importance of collaboration. We can't look at events as merely just episodes in history or the moments that we're experiencing that where we often have to rush into to witness them, to document them. I think that if we think about, let's say, the crisis in Yemen, or if there's a new blockade in Syria, or whatever the subject is, the biggest challenge right now is not having enough capacity to really commit to monitoring and entrenching oneself into an issue area or subject matter. Because the beat and the movement of the news is so fast and so quick, so there's not as much in-depth investigations or reporting or enough time or capacity to be in the field. Like, even with the rise, I think, of digital reporting, which is such an asset to all of us and to everyone, it's created a space where I'm seeing more local newsrooms are closing, and even international journalists who typically would be in the field are no longer able to go into the field. Less resources are going into field work. And those who do, as freelancers, don't get any support, pay out of pocket, aren't insured, have no protections, they're taking the risk, and a lot of times their stories aren't even taken. And I remember that when I was in Yemen last summer in Sana'a, it was my first time in years being there. And the importance of being in the field or working with people, local practitioners, where they're so critical. I was telling you the story, but I went to renew my ID so I could continue to gain access to Sana'a. And the Houthis, I had to go through the Houthis, and it turned out that one of the guys who worked at the ministry who would issue my ID asked me, he goes, "Are you a journalist?" And by the way, I'm a complete imposter here. I'm not a journalist. I'm a citizen journalist, human rights advocate, but I'm not a journalist. And more importantly, I didn't want them to know that I was a journalist. But he said, no, don't worry. I just have a lot to share with you. It was my wedding hall that was hit by an airstrike like 2 summers ago. It was like one of the most famous, biggest cases where 160 people were killed, and it was actually a funeral that was happening. And he told me, he goes, I have I owned the venue, but it was also my uncle's funeral, and so all the men in my family were killed. And so what I want to know is who could report on the long-term impact this has been having on the orphans and the children and the women that were left behind. I'm working, but I don't have I can't support them. We don't care about criminal accountability. How about reparations? How could they compensate these families? And so it's these little nuggets that are so hard to find if you're not that close, that I accidentally fell into. So I think that's a really important aspect of it as well.
True.
So the problem we've chosen to solve is organized crime and corruption in Eastern Europe and Russia and other places like that. So I'm not going to sit here and say we've had a lot of solutions and problems solved. We have found that, the easy answer is, we have a very forensic approach to everything, and we basically build a prosecution that we publish, and that has been more impactful. And we also work with the what's called the Global Anti-Corruption Consortium, which is a project with Transparency International, where we put all our information that we've collected for a story over the wall and allow activists to go out and use that information to more effectively solve the problem. We're journalists. We don't know what the solution is. We don't want to pretend we know what the solution is, because if we know what the solution is, it's going to be really hard to report that story fairly, right? So we have to be kind of impartial. We're judges. But the activists can run with the information, and so normally that's been stovepiped in the past, but we believe, especially in the countries that we work in, it's important for them to get access to that information, and they often share that information with police or others. They file Magnitsky filings or suspicious wealth orders, and we've had $10 billion in assets that have been taken away from bad people and given back to governments, which is a significant, probably more than a million charities combined in terms of, taking money out of bad people and giving it back to good people. But I think there's a bigger issue here, and I would say we're failing as journalists to really solve the bigger problem, and that's that a lot of people are not really listening to us. And that's the important thing that we need to change. And I think, my theory on this is that, 30 years ago, when you lived in some suburb and you got your mail, and your newspaper thrown in your front yard, you got a 24-hour incremental change in what happened in the world. And that's what that newspaper was. And you understood that because you were from that community, and you knew that community, and you knew the people, and it made sense to you. And you could act on that, and you could vote appropriately, and you could do everything. But 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we really globalized. And people's lives aren't in that community anymore. We work virtually, our lives are virtual, our friends are virtual, everything is crossing the world. We think we know who Vladimir Putin is. You have no idea who Vladimir Putin is. And so consequently, we're looking for answers. And where we find answers are places like QAnon and Facebook and other things like that. And people do not have the context to understand how the world works. And so I really think our mission has changed in journalism. That many of us are nonprofit journalism, so we're not trying to sell a newspaper or some TV advertisement on CNN. Our mission is to help the people understand what's going on. And we haven't done it. We really need to explain how the world works now, because people don't know how it works right now. They don't know what's behind the Republican Party. They do not know who's behind the Tory Party. They don't have that context, and they're grasping at conspiracies and ideas and other things to try to explain it. So I think the next step is to really do a better job communicating how the world really works.
In a way that people actually want to read, which I think is another part of the challenge. I think we sometimes assume people want to know more about things that we think are important and interesting, but maybe our readers and our consumers of our content don't want to consume it in that way. But sometimes they do. What frustrates you? What kind of coverage about the issues that are most important to you just drive you crazy? When does the media just get it wrong, make it worse, like sort of underscore, the wrong narrative. Why don't we start with Raja on this one?
Okay. I could give a recent example, which was really frustrating. That's just me being delicate. And I think it is, I've had the unfortunate experience of operating and working and supporting local practitioners across many conflicts, from Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya, entrenched in these spaces. And I've seen the incredible work of local, international journalists coming together and collaborating and really building trust with local communities to do some impactful reporting. And then all that went to shit when the Ukrainian war started. And what we find are journalists who have major platforms speaking and describing the Ukrainian war as one that is different than others because people aren't civilized here. They look like us. They sound like us. And these are reputable journalists who are reporting and using this language. And so you have over a decade of hard work that outsiders have put into building trust with local sources going down the toilet because of some people like that. And so I could tell you this makes it harder for each of you to go into communities because you have to do damage control because of things like that. So the same journalist that had built relationships with those local sources and local practitioners, those practitioners and sources are watching that same person on TV just shit all over them. And so I think that is one very big frustration that has been unaddressed as well.
I'm always going to ask what upsets people on panels. This is really exciting. Nicola, what upsets you?
Well, I mean, I think one of those things, as I already said, about sort of the context of the why, when you're left thinking, but you've just told me what's going on, so, that piece on it. The other is actually, though, it's partly what you've just said, which is people don't want it, make refugees sexy. And I'm left thinking we can put people on the moon, we can innovate, we can do all of this stuff. Can we not, through our creativity, find the angle to tell a story, to sell something, or to engage? And so, I mean, one of the things that, for example, we found a NASA scientist who'd been looking at lights going out in Syria through the course of the Syria war. So 4 years into Syria's conflict, the tension is waning, very hard to get media coverage. And so through that time-lapse photography of looking at what it shows, you could see the destruction of what had happened to Syria. 83% of the infrastructure had been destroyed, and you can see it through time-lapse. And that was the way that we worked and got floor-to-floor coverage of that statistic, of global coverage. We worked with the BBC in that instance to get the way into what was happening in Syria, to then be able to tell the story of why there needed to be more humanitarian access crossing borders, of why there needed to be stronger pressure on the regime around the need for a political solution, and why there needed to be progress on holding people to account, each of which there was actually more pressure as a result of that coverage. And so I guess it's that plea for creativity and imagination. Is it really that hard for us to be able to find ways to tell these complicated things about the world in ways that actually are engaging and feel relevant, whether that's to inspire, to inform, to provoke, to encourage, all of which I think is part of making change.
And I'm going to give it to Drew in a second, but I do want to just say one thing as someone from The Guardian about this. We find sometimes that if we change the lens through which we tell the story, we can reach audiences more effectively. And one thing that we know about our audience is that our audience really loves to read about the environment from The Guardian. It is the strongest part of our reporting coverage. It engages the most readers. It drives the most reader revenue. When we ask our readers what they'd like more of, they would like more environment coverage. And so we have found that especially in reporting on racial injustice in the US, that we have been the most effective by telling it through the stories of food insecurity, waste in communities, and if we lead with environment, we can tell complicated stories about entrenched racism, and I think that's part of the way we solve the problem of reporting on something that if we tried to serve it just as, you know, a racial injustice story, it would be like trying to get people to eat the spinach I had at lunch.
I mean, it's one of the things that we say, this is one of the things I can just about get away with, but we say to our team, be a good date. It's like, what does your audience want to talk about? And so if what you're talking about of conflict is not the story, but they're really interested in the environment, let me tell you about the Sahel, about what it means, about how climate change is impacting. And I think that point about change the lens, be a good date, I think is really wise. And so it's that encouragement of how can we, I don't know what the dating, I'm going to get very lost in the dating.
No, that's a good, and I think it's also to tell the story and and relay the information in a way where the audience could also relay it to their friends. So they could feel empowered to actually share that with other people in a language, and with, like, think about linguistics, think about, you know, so that's a big part of that too.
Yeah, I find myself disagreeing with you a little bit here, because I honestly think we are in kind of the golden age of storytelling. I have not seen better storytelling in journalism in my 30 years than is happening right now. There are some brilliant people doing incredibly creative work, you know, on podcasts, on independent, you know, film and video, on, you know, YouTube channels. We are really telling more stories better than we ever have. And people I also disagree that people don't care about this stuff. They badly care about this, but they don't care about it in the way that maybe we see it as journalists. You know, the Trump voters out there, they had a really legitimate concern. Their communities were being hollowed out. They had opioid addictions. Their jobs weren't as good. You know, money was flowing to wealthy people and not to them. And we, you know, what we haven't done is explain why money is flowing to other people. We haven't explained the whole system of how politics works and how plutocracy in England and the United States and Europe has really taken over, you know, our political systems. We're not telling the stories. That's the reality of the situation. We have failed to dig deep enough, and we're caught up in the theater of politics. And that's the real problem. And I think if you got down to these issues, you know why we can't solve the environmental problem? It's organized crime and it's moneyed interests. And they won't let you do it. And they won't let you do it because they are making a lot of money off of it. And that's what's happening in a lot of these things. And we haven't put the pieces together to explain the whole story to people. They do really, really care. They're just not getting the story. And if we think that a clever lead or is going to make the difference, it's not. What really is a combination of good storytelling, which I think is inherently there in the media today. I'm proud of the work that they're doing. But it's us failing to go deep enough to really get to the heart of where these problems are happening.
Well, now I'll disagree. Just to add this in, we're seeing such a steep decline in people's consumption of news. I mean, it's a troubling trend.
But it's because we're not telling them the story.
Well, I think they're kind of tired of the story. I mean, I think it's a complicated thing. I think there are very good stories to tell. We should tell the stories more deeply. We should seek solutions with our journalism, but we should also recognize when we might be exhausting our audience and when we might lose them in the process. And I think that's a really, really important thing to consider, is when you accidentally turn everyone off from wanting to see a lot more of it. I led a session this morning about starvation and food insecurity in Africa and the impending, famine crisis. And, that'll be one of the most complicated stories for all of us to report across the next year and probably across the next decade. And, keeping our audiences from just tuning it out and looking at that as a story of other people on the other side of the world that don't look familiar to us is going to be a big challenge.
But we're not explaining how that story goes into our countries and how our businesses and our governments and our companies are making that happen because of systematic things that they've done to take advantage of grifts in the system to make more money. I mean, it really is, I think, we've told an incomplete story, and anytime you see the end effect, you can tell the story about the end effect, but if you don't tell the full story about what's really happening, and it's frightening, when you look at what's really happening, the world is an incredibly corrupt place, and it's really scary what's happening, and you're not seeing that. And people and journalists are not telling that, and it's because we don't have the resources to go deep enough, and there's a lot of different reasons. But I think we're only telling part of the story, and I think people care about stuff that affects their lives, and they'll always care no matter how depressing or how complicated it is. In fact, complicated stories, studies have shown that people assign more credibility to them. They want complication, and we often don't give it to them, and we often just don't dig deep enough. It's our fault.
Can I just pick up?
Yeah. We'll get to
Not
Q&A
on
in
the-
just a little bit. I promise you'll be on it.
But not on the doom and gloom, because I really agree, Drew, of getting to the complexity, because it exposes, it's like a ball of wool about actually what are the threads that need to be pulled to be dealt with. So, for example, right now in Sudan, the story is two guys fighting, they're both military. But the story underneath that is this guy that was part of the Janjaweed, like the of the Darfur, this guy called Hemeti, was bankrolled by Bashir, the former dictator, to be a kind of offset, because Bashir was frightened of being overthrown by the army. And Hemeti has managed to amass an army that's as big as the National Army. I mean, amazing. Why? Because it's an international criminal conspiracy where he is backed by the Wagner Group. He is deploying mercenaries to Yemen. That there is it is the economy stupid, right? And if you start to expose that story, I've only said 4 sentences, but when you start, maybe 5, but when you start to unravel those angles, then you start to think about, so what could be done when the diplomats run in to go and say they're going to talk, because the African Union is sending 3 heads of state. It is shut off that resource that keeps him going. It's the economy stupid. There's a root in there. There's a consequence. But the story that says, it's 2 armies fighting and please let's have a peace deal and a humanitarian corridor, that doesn't get to it. And I think that that's the piece. Kieran, I mean, you said something earlier, which I won't repeat, so I don't want the quote, but when crisis action is never cited in the media. But I think that sense of the underpinnings, as you say, about things being complicated, and we understand that money talks. It's not the only thing that talks. But when we expose those pieces, the why, and in ways that can be, I think, engaging, it starts to speak to the possibility, and stuff can be done about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Could I add just to that? I think it's like, just the way you described it, it's this guy versus this guy fighting each other. That's the same story we've been hearing for over a decade. Just swap out the countries and the armed forces that are included in that story. It is the same type of storytelling that we've been hearing. Meanwhile, it's like, for example, looking at like the stories of checkpoints. This is an art in most parts of the world, whether you're in conflict or not in conflict. Going through Yemen's checkpoints or checkpoints in Syria, for example, these aren't really for security. They're war economy. That's how people pay for their rent, how people pay for their daily food rations, how people pay for their armed men, for their weapons. So it's, meanwhile, I'd be watching a report say, like, talking about the security risks around this, and it's just like, no, it's so much bigger. It's perpetuating this is why the conflict isn't going to end, right? There's too much money being made, and it goes to the point, follow the money, right? Who's making money, out of all of this?
We're going to open it to Q&A in just maybe like 4 or 5 minutes, I think. But I want to ask sort of one more question before we do that. So these are really tough issues, right? So I'm often, sort of when we talk about solutions in journalism, like sometimes it's just like really hard, like gun deaths in America. It's hard to find like the solution angle on that other than get rid of the guns. Like how do you deal with that? I mean, these are huge, hairy, complicated problems. Like, do you think about what the solution is? I mean, Drew, you said earlier that you don't lead with that, which I think is important. But like, is part of the journalistic inquiry about like surfacing the solution? Is that the way you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think let's take an example. Debt in Africa and other places. Debt is being generated in Africa because J.P. Morgan is selling this to American consumers, and they need a bunch of debt, much like the housing crisis in 2008. And so they generate debt. The Russian and Chinese banks help the leaders of these countries steal the debt. and then J.P. Morgan buys it all and then stripes it and sells it to consumers. And everybody's making money and everybody's happy, and it's a good system that works for the people who are doing this. And I think what you have to do is really get forensically down into explaining everybody who's doing this, and then look for pressure points where you can put pressure on it, like J.P. Morgan, which shouldn't be doing this kind of stuff. So, I mean, it really comes down to explaining the whole system that's out there, and then finding, the organizations that are responsible for doing this, finding the place where they can disconnect it and cut off the power into that system. I think that's the only way to do it.
Okay.
There's two things for me. I mean, one is the reason I have the deep privilege of doing what I'm doing is because I started my work in the wake of the Rwandan genocide, and my colleague lost 31 members of her family in the genocide. Her parents, her siblings, her husband, only her 3 daughters survived. And it's her resilience and her heart and the fact that she keeps going. Incidentally, she trained as a counsellor to try and help people that had become widows of the genocide in a culture where people don't talk. And so, on the one hand, that sense of how do you deal with these really complex problems is actually by listening, the extraordinary inspiration that comes to me by watching human beings at our most incredible. But there's also another thing, alongside all these complicated things, there's always something going on, actually, that is about making it better. It's never only ever doom and gloom. So, for example, one of the great tragedies of my working life, of our lives, is the Syrian conflict, of the hundreds of thousands of people who have been killed, of a country, a middle-income country, decimated through more than a decade of conflict. So much about that is arguably a failure, although there are ways where crisis action has helped aid cross borders, of get justice for those. There's some positive stuff. But right now, 10 years in, hundreds of thousands, more than 100,000 families, 100,000 people have been detained, either by the regime or others. And their families still don't know what has happened to them. But we have supported those families to go, first of all, to the UN Secretary General to say it is really traumatizing to have to go each time to a different institution to try and find out where our family member might be. Can you recommend a mechanism that will be a one-stop shop where we can find out where our family members might be, we can share, we can get assistance? The Secretary General of the United Nations listened to that plea and made a recommendation to member states. Then Crisis Action worked with journalists to tell the story, for example, to Latin American audiences who know about disappearances and have an experience of where the state has disappeared their people. And in the next couple of weeks, we think the United Nations General Assembly will vote to establish that missing persons mechanism. And the incredible thing about it is, speaking with those Syrian families, I would not arrogate to myself to say I'm trying to heal people. But when I hear those families, and it's in the propaganda, and Habib from our partner working with Impunity Watch, and he said through this campaign, I heard him say it to me, through this campaign, Syrian families are recovering something of their agency and their loss. The unfathomable has happened, and yet still there are things that can be done that are really making a difference. And so that always gives me hope and inspiration in the midst of the complexity. There are ways in, there are things to do, and there are things that are happening.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Q&A because I think we're now down to about 5 minutes, and you've had your hand up like the whole time.
Hi, Khalil Yusuf from the Amdia Muslim Community Press Office. First of all, it was a really excellent session today, and I really appreciate your disruptive language, and I use that word disruptive in the most positive sense of the word. I was really compelled by what you were saying about racial discrimination and, religious discrimination. You didn't mention it, but that also exists significantly in getting people to listen. We often find that in relation to Islam, for example, it's very quick for reports to be made about terrorism and extremism, which of course we need to hear about. But we've been doing 100 years of great work. We've got a 100-year-old women's movement, which was established just after the suffragettes. Massive amounts of community work in 195 countries. We've had great difficulty in getting traction. Nobody seems to be interested, in your words, nobody wants to listen. So how do we make positive stories, good stories, get traction within the media? I mean, your thoughts would be really appreciated.
Who wants to respond? Drew?
So yeah, I mean, terrorists are terrorists, Muslims are Muslims, and the news organizations have to do really a better job of explaining who terrorists are, why they're doing what they're doing, how they're doing it, how they're recruiting people, and their operations. And if you look at that, and if you look at how the systems work, you'll realize this is not normal people. These are extreme people, and they've been made more extreme from radical teaching that's going on. And so, a lot of it is really, going in and looking at the culture of these things and helping people understand who you're really dealing with. We deal a lot with criminals. Criminals have people have an idea what criminals are, but criminals are a certain culture, and you have to understand that culture, and you have to explain that culture to readers, and then they will understand that these are not, this is not a whole group. This is a group. This is a small group of people.
Great. A couple more questions, and maybe why don't we do this? Why don't we do a round of questions, and then we'll answer them all at the same time, just so that we don't leave anybody out. You get to go though, because you're or whoever.
Hi. Hi, my name is Paulina Bashlikova. I'm a freelance journalist based in Copenhagen. So thank you for that talk. It was, very inspiring, and also just, I love how your perspectives really diverged in certain ways. And I think I have a specific question about kind of burnout when it comes to working with solutions journalism. Specifically, I find that with some issues, at least ones that I've reported on, especially once you get deeper and deeper into them, you see the solution. You've been reporting on it forever. You've tried different angles, different formats. You discover the solution and it's right there, whether it's legal change or whether it's, well, from my perspective, mostly legal change, but it's bright as day, and after a very long time, nothing is really happening in terms of the kind of impact that would make you feel really good about your work. So for me, sometimes that can feel a bit dispiriting, especially if I'm emotionally involved in what I'm writing about. So in terms of your newsrooms and also your experience, how do you sort of find the motivation to keep going when it feels like you've seen the solution and yet no one else is really waking up to it? Thank you.
Okay, don't answer it yet. We're going to do 2 more questions, and we're going to do like a rapid fire response on it. Were there other questions? Nobody has any. Okay, who wants to answer this question?
Yeah, I'll take a quick question. So yeah, this is a problem. You learn the story, you get the depth of the story, but there's a reason why the laws don't get changed. Politicians are taking money from certain people. They'll say, "Oh, I'm against that," but there's a reason why they're against it. There's a reason why it's either it has to do with their constituency or it has to do with money. It's either the power or the money. So it's the power or the money. And so part of it is really determining what it is, the pressure points that are making people make the decisions that they want, and ask them, what would make you change your vote? What is it that would make you look differently? And if you kind of do that kind of in-depth reporting, sometimes you might find that these things can change.
I mean, I would say to both questions, actually. I mean, one is, it's the thing I said before, if the solution you want is so obvious, analyze the barriers to change. So as Drew said, why is it not happening? And that same question about why are the stories not happening? Do we understand, those of us that are not journalists, what is it that journalists, what do you need? Not all of you are focused on solutions or impact. That's not why you exist. But what is it, in those cases, where are the win-win partnerships? What is it that we can do that can help you break stories, break news, get coverage? And that's why we think of ourselves at Crisis Action sort of as the one-stop shop. For trying to help actually find those stories, get coverage, find new angles, get the background, get the context. But the other thing I think is, and I knew we'd come back to the C word of collaboration. I mean, I passionately believe life is a team sport. Every difficult problem has to be solved, I think, with others. And I spoke to somebody earlier today who said they were journalists by training and inclination. And if I may suggest, those of you that are journalists, you are special creatures, but you're often lone wolves, and you often think that you're having to do stuff by yourselves. And that's the delusion or the illusion. And actually, by seeking the power of collaboration,
you're never alone in it. And it's what I say to my team. I've actually said it to somebody today. We're facing some really big waves, and I feel like we are standing on the beach. But the fact that I am holding on to hands for a chain of people as long as my eye can see does actually mean that I do feel we are much less likely to get hit by the wave. And when the wave happens, I'm getting pulled up by the people around me. And I do think that the world is complicated. People are working incredibly hard. I think that spirit of collaboration, or figuring out how can I work with others when I'm feeling lonely, or who will be pulling me up when I feel like I'm about to be hit by the wave. And it's why I also have the deep privilege of doing what I do, of connecting with a global network of allies, of which I believe you in this room are part of them. You may not want to be part of my date or on my bus, but I'm claiming you, so thanks.
Okay, we're just at the end, but I want to give Raja the last word here.
Yeah, oh, that's a lot of pressure. But I think speaking to your point and just reemphasizing all of your points, I think we are at a point where I've spent the last decade training local practitioners on the technical part of reporting, documenting, using tech, using video, and people have become masters at it. Just brilliant at it. Even in the worst and the most challenging environments, things are getting done, and done well, right? I think one of the biggest challenges and gaps that there's been is there's so much being done around building and enhancing the technical infrastructure of our ecosystem and how we're operating, but not enough being invested in the human and social part of the infrastructure. Tech is being created for journalists and for practitioners, but it really isn't user-friendly, right? Everything is in English. One person from The Guardian, a good friend of mine who works at The Guardian, who's tried using open source tools, told me it's as if they deliberately made it complicated for me to use because of gatekeeping. But there is a new movement happening right now to try to address this from fatigue and exhaustion, and it is around collaboration. There are communities of practice that are being formed, being renewed, and it's not just journalists, it's people from different disciplines coming together and recognizing that I'm not a journalist by trade, but I sit at the intersection and I value the expertise of everyone in this room. We are not the experts here, we're all experts. My expertise is a culmination of experiences and testimonies and experimentation with amateurs who are just the first time trying at the age of 20 how to use video or tech, to incredible experts like you guys who I get to share this platform with. So you aren't alone, and I think it's really important, and I have some printed materials.
We have to wrap up.
Oh, sorry. But I could share with you guys some of the communities of practice and the resources that we're developing around this for those who are interested.
Buy them all a cocktail. Thank you very much.
Rachel? Yes. Thank you, Fred.
Thank you.
Thanks.